Hi, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in and listening again to our podcast. It's Lauren. Today, we're going to address some eating disorders, kind of talk about that. Savanna and I decided to kind of share a little bit of personal information about both of us and our own struggles with this issue, unhealthy eating habits, maybe some body dysmorphia too, and then just personal ways of how we've come to overcome it in our own lives, and just offer basic suggestions for anybody listening that might be struggling with these. But before we jump into this very heavy topic, let's just kind of check in with each other. So Savanna, how have you been since I've last seen you? And
I feel like it's been forever since we've sat down and talked, and we just saw each other for the birthday party. That was like, what, a week and a half ago? It was on Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's been forever since I've seen you, because you went on vacation, and like our little group chat, like Jen's whole house was sick, Casey had stuff going on, you were on vacation. I'm like, it's like really quiet on this chat right now. Like I feel very disconnected from everybody. How was your vacation?
Oh yeah, it was great. So for anybody listening in, my family and I, so my husband and my child and myself, we went to Hawaii, to the Big Island, and it was beautiful and amazing, of course, just how Hawaii is. But to share like a little personal story about being in Hawaii, before I left, I had a session with my therapist, and giving her a little shout out, she gave me a great idea of something that I could do while I was in Hawaii. And she said, while you're in this beautiful place, why don't you, because I've had so much death in my personal life over the last year, she said, why don't you take a rock for everybody that you've lost this last year? So a rock for my parents, for my husband's grandma, and then we recently had to put 2 dogs down, which if anybody has animals, they're just as much a part of your family as
that's
a person.
Hard. Yeah.
So she said, take a rock for every death that you've had and go to the beach and, have these rocks symbolize these people in your life that you've lost, and just think something, say something, and then toss it into the ocean. And while you do that, you're leaving the grief and the sadness in just this beautiful place. And I loved the idea, and I ended up talking with my doula about it. And she's a birth doula, a death doula, and she's also a therapist herself. And she almost added on to this idea. And she said, while you do that, why don't you almost like make an altar too, draw in the sand and make something beautiful for them. And I really loved that idea. And we live in Las Vegas, Savanna and I live in Las Vegas, and it's beautiful here. There's mountains, there's lots of hiking opportunities. And she said, you could do that here too. But I loved the idea of doing it in Hawaii. So I drew in the sand and I placed these rocks in a beautiful place. And I just sat with them, and then I let the waves come in and take them away. And it was just very peaceful, and it felt like it was almost my own time and my own grief that was special for myself that I was able to do. So I wanted to share that with everybody, just in case anybody else resonated with it and maybe would want to try it with their own lives.
Did it feel like another goodbye? Like, do you feel any less tension, any more healing, more peace about it? Like, did it bring any more closure for you?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think just the heaviness doesn't feel as heavy. More closure, probably. Yeah, I could agree with that. It was just when you're going through a funeral for somebody, it feels sometimes, especially when you're so close to that person, sometimes it feels very almost disconnected. You're still in the beginning stages of your grief. You don't feel connected in a way. It feels very out of touch. And so, especially with the funerals for my parents, I had to plan everything. I was in charge of everything. I had to pay for everything. And I did have family come and help me, but it felt that there was a lot on my shoulders. And so it didn't feel that I could sit back and I don't know how else to say it, but enjoy the process.
Like you had to more orchestrate it rather than
Yeah.
go through the experience.
Right.
You had to set up the experience for everyone else.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
exactly.
really hard.
Yeah. So I felt like this was almost like the space and the time for myself, where it was like, okay, I can grieve for these people in a space where I feel connected to them.
It's really special. What is a death doula?
It's somebody that helps you work through death in your life. I don't know, let me look it up, what like a doula definition is. Let's see. Okay, so it's the definition of doula. It's typically a woman who offers guidance and support. And so this could be somebody that provides guidance and support during labor and childbirth, but then it can also be somebody who does this for death situations.
Okay, so big like monumental life events. Okay, tell me about your traveling, because you had quite a delay in flights. Talk about that. And also the airport in Hawaii is outside, which I think is crazy because they get like crazy storms and stuff, don't they?
Yeah.
So if you have people flying in, they're just like standing out in the cold.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it really gets that cold there.
What was it when you were there?
Let's see. It was probably in the 70s during the day, and then in the evenings it could drop down in the 60s. So it could get somewhat chilly. Chilly in regards to the humidity and the rain, makes it feel cold. I'm not going to say the airline that I flew, but getting out there was a little rough. Our flight leaving Las Vegas to LA was delayed 9 hours, which resulted in us missing our flight to Hawaii from LA. So they put us on the next flight the following day. So we arrived a full 24 hours later than we had planned, which was frustrating. And they stated it was for staffing issues, which I think unfortunately a lot of airlines are really struggling because of COVID. We were talking to some of the people that work for the airline, and they were saying that when they started to fly again and things started to pick up after COVID, people just didn't want to come back to work. They're like, there's just nobody that's willing to come in and work, which is just so sad.
Yeah.
It's just this trickling effect where these people are struggling and they're trying to make ends meet and do their job, and there's not enough employees, and then we're the customers that are paying for flights are the ones that are also suffering because we're not able to go anywhere, or flights are delayed.
Well, and then also on the other hand, I think it also brought to light the fact that a lot of people are overworked and underpaid, and most jobs can be done from home, but there's a big difference between somebody being like a customer service representative who's just sitting in a cubicle all day, where that probably could be done from home, versus like, you should probably be on the airplane.
Yeah.
If you
like
work
pilot
for an airline, you should probably show up to that job. Like, that's your environment. Okay, and then coming home, and you have a 3-year-old, so how was traveling with him?
Yeah, so coming home, this was because of the weather, because of all the storms that have been happening on the West Coast. And our flight was originally supposed to leave Hawaii 9:30, 10 p.m. around that time, and everything in Hawaii closes really early. So we had to return our rental car. It got to the point where it was too late to get any hotel rooms, and then our flight got delayed until 4:30 a.m. And like you mentioned earlier, the entire airport is all outside. It's all outdoors. I think there's one waiting room that's inside, and you're sitting outside. I'm just trying to get my toddler to sleep, just because I'm like, okay, well, like as long as he sleeps, then we'll be okay. And then it was just a very, very long travel experience. So by the time we get to LA, then our flight from LA to Vegas is delayed, and not too bad. But then we get on the flight and we're sitting in the airplane, and it's delayed on the runway again. And it was just cue mental breakdown. I was like, I just want to go home.
So from you returning your rental car at 10 p.m. until you take off at or board at 4:30 a.m., you're outside that entire time?
Mm-hmm.
That's bananas.
Yeah.
I would have had a mental breakdown way before even getting to Vegas or to LA.
Mm-hmm.
I would have been sobbing outside.
Yeah.
So kudos to you for holding it together, because I would have been like, well, we just live here now. I'm sorry, have things shipped to us. This is where we reside now.
Yeah. And then in regards to like my toddler, I just want to say thank goodness for iPads and technology, because I'm just like, here's a movie you can watch. And
did he end up getting a nap or anything?
Yeah. Thankfully, he ended up pretty much sleeping the entire flight from Hawaii to LA.
Oh, good.
Which is a good.
How long is that flight?
Almost 5 hours.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm glad he slept for you, so you had a chance to breathe.
Oh yeah, it was rough, but Hawaii is amazing and beautiful.
So in the meantime, since you've been gone, the podcast has gotten some really exciting news. So Lauren and I are currently, if you're just an audio listener, are currently recording in a studio that has chosen to sponsor us. So if you're in the Vegas area and you are a podcaster, Ignis Umbra Studios is where you want to be. This is a big deal for us. We're not just recording on Riverside like we have. So yeah, we're very excited to be here and very thankful that we got the opportunity. And we wanted to get into this episode about eating disorders. We had kind of touched on it in the episode with Adriel, but had decided to make this its own episode for anybody who might be struggling with it. We can have a discussion. So I just want to say, if you are battling an eating disorder, you are not alone. I was doing some research this morning and read some like pretty big misconceptions about eating disorders, and something that I thought was kind of interesting was I read that there was a study done, I believe in 2007, and of all the people who have an eating disorder, 1/3 of those people are male.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that?
Yeah, I definitely know that it's in the population of people that identify as male. It's definitely an issue just as much as it is with women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a negative stigma. It's hard for men to seek out help. Number one, in therapy anyways, it can be very challenging to just say, oh, you know what, I think I need some help and seek out there. But then especially for something like an eating disorder, it can be very challenging, because I think that there's just this negative stigma, or also that there's the stigma of just being a man, like, oh, you should be tough, you shouldn't be experiencing this, you shouldn't be struggling with something like this, and just to normalize it, like saying like it's okay, like it's okay if you're struggling with these things. And also to preface, I'm not an eating disorder specialist. We're just going to briefly kind of go over it. But if you are struggling with an eating disorder, it's very important to find appropriate help, to look into maybe finding a therapist that does specialize in eating disorders. And you can use the site that I've mentioned before. It's called psychologytoday.com. And there's check boxes. You can select if you want to use your insurance, what area you live in. It'll populate a list of therapists in that area. And then you can also select the issues that you want to address. So if you're wanting to address an eating disorder, you can select that from a checkbox, and it'll populate the therapists that can work on that with you. And then also, it's very important to make appointments with a medical provider, and if your insurance can cover it, maybe even a nutritionist, and sitting down and getting all of these different people's opinions and feedback of what you can, together with them, identify as what is healthy for you is very important.
Do you think people that have eating disorders, and I can speak for myself, I can't speak for you or for anybody else, but is it something that people typically recognize in themselves, or is it something that other people around them notice and bring up to them? Like, I think you could be struggling. Because with me, I didn't realize that I was doing something wrong or that something was off until my parents sat me down. And then now looking back, I'm like, okay, so the signs were there, but I didn't think anything was wrong. With you, did you notice it in yourself, or did someone else bring it to your attention?
I don't think I noticed it within myself until I was in my teens. And then I think my eating disorder probably started when I was like about 8 years old.
Really? That young?
Yeah. I felt like I needed to go on a diet, and so I started to restrict my food intake, and I would see how long I could go without eating, to the point where I was struggling in school, and there was probably some issues, and so by the time I was a teen, my mom had talked to me about it, and I just said, it's not that big of a deal. Like, I'll be okay. I'll fix it myself. And then we just kind of never really addressed it again.
So you use the word diet, which is typically something used in, like, you were 8, so I'm thinking probably magazines or the media of some sort. Did you hear your parents talk about dieting? Did you get it from society basically shoving diet culture down your throat? Like, where did you pick up that you thought you needed a diet?
It was probably a combination of things. It was probably friends at school and just listening to them talk about it. And then media. I think growing up in the 90s, there's the label of being, what is it? Is it heroin chic? I believe was the label in the 90s, where women that were models in magazines, like that's what was looked for.
To be super sucked up.
Yes. To be just very unhealthily thin.
Yeah.
Very thin in an unhealthy way.
Yeah.
Actually.
Like emaciated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was a combination of growing up in the 90s, listening to friends talk about it at school. I think I had heard my mom maybe a few times say, like, oh, I feel like I need to go on a diet. And so then listening to all that, I was like, well, then I should be doing that too.
So that kind of goes into what we were talking about last night. Like, I want to kind of drive this point home, is like the way that you speak about yourself, the things that you say around your children pick up on it, whether you think they're listening or not. And this goes for having daughters or sons. The way that you speak about your body, the way that your husband speaks about his body, your kids hear that and they absorb that. And they start to wonder later, is there something wrong with me? Or if you have a son and he hears you talking about, I'm so fat or whatever, he's going to start to think that women that have a curvier nature, when he's looking for partners, that they should look a certain way. That women who have, a certain body type, that's not good, because my mom always shamed that. So they're going to grow up thinking that one certain body type is what's normal, and anything outside of that standard isn't attractive. Mm-hmm. So daughters or sons, we really need to be careful about what we're saying about ourselves, or our husbands are saying about themselves in front of their kids. And yeah, because you just basically proved the point of what we were talking about last night, that you kind of heard your mom talking about it and it planted a seed.
Yeah, definitely. I 1000% agree with you that children, you're their first role model. Mm-hmm. in the house, and they're watching everything that you're doing. They're watching you look at yourself in the mirror. They're watching you in everything that you're doing. And so, if there's days where you don't feel like yourself, or if you have already been doing these things and now you're becoming aware of it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that. It's not too late to make positive changes. Mm-hmm. If you want to teach your children to love themselves, you have to model that behavior as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's also a difference between a parent who is constantly trying the next diet fad, and now I'm doing keto, now I'm doing paleo, now I'm doing Atkins, or whatever it is, Weight Watchers, I don't know all the diets. But you can absolutely encourage your child to just start eating healthy. Like, it's okay to diet if that's what you feel, but you can also just start eating more fruits and vegetables, and do that as a family. Like, get your kids involved and make them want to make healthy choices without just feeling like I need to lose some weight, so it needs to be a diet. Mm-hmm. Like, no, we're just going to go exercise as a family instead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And being healthy doesn't necessarily have to mean weight. Mm-hmm. Doesn't necessarily have to mean like, okay, how much am I weighing, and things like that. It could just be like, how do I feel? Mm-hmm. So being very mindful about what you're consuming, what you're eating, and how does it make you feel physically, mentally. Exercising, like, everybody talks about exercise, and some people can't stand exercising, but it could be about finding what exercises you enjoy doing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you like to do? What do you find fun, and what is something that you're going to continue to do for a while? And then how do you feel after you're doing these things? And so focusing on that, and then everything else kind of falls into place.
I think when people think of exercise, they think of like somebody hitting the gym or going for like a run, and it doesn't have to be something that like that's so like monotonous and mundane. Even I can't remember what the status was or the statistic, but even bowling, like when Bobby and I go bowling, the next day he is so sore.
Uh-huh.
And you know, they have like the little screens above the bowling lanes, and one of the little fun facts or whatever was like bowling 4 games is the equivalent of running a mile or something like that. Like something that's fun you can do as a family, and it's still exercise. You're getting out, getting some fresh air, doing something that you love, but it's still getting your body moving. So it doesn't have to be sitting on a treadmill for an hour and a half. You can go out and do something, or just take your kid to the park and play tag. Still exercise.
Oh yeah.
Or just walk your kid upstairs to their room 10 times because they forgot something else. Also exercise. What else? You wanted to talk about healing.
Yes, yeah. We can talk a little bit about the different kinds of eating disorders.
Okay.
So you had asked just a little while ago, could an eating disorder be something that I intuitively realize about myself, or could it be something that other people notice about me? And there's different types of eating disorders where you, from an outsider's perspective, the person's physical body meets criteria for a healthy weight or a healthy body type, but they're internally struggling with an eating disorder. So from the outside perspective, somebody could look at somebody and say, oh, they look healthy, they look totally fine. They're not underweight, they're not overweight, there's no issue, but internally and behind closed doors, they're struggling. Eating disorders are very shameful. They're typically done in secrecy and privacy because there's so much shame associated with it that it can be hard for other people to notice and see these things. So just really quickly, like some eating disorders, there's a few that aren't widely known, and then I can talk about some that usually people have heard of. There's pica, which is eating foods that aren't eating non-food substances, so eating things that aren't a food, that wouldn't offer any nutritional value, and they can sometimes come along with other, like a comorbidity, meaning another diagnosis. So it could come along with autism or an intellectual disability, but also pregnant women can struggle with this.
I was just thinking that you see a lot of warnings when you're pregnant about like if you're craving something that's not food, like chalk or mud, talk to your doctor about it. But that's so weird that it would be associated with pregnancy. Why is that?
I think, I'm not 100% sure. I think it has to do with some sort of nutritional...
Like a deficiency?
Yes,
okay.
A nutritional deficiency, where that's why it's so important to go and talk to a doctor about it and not to have any shame associated with that, because it's something that could potentially be a somewhat easy fix, where you can go and talk to a doctor and they can say, oh, okay, well, here's what we can do to help you with this. Mm-hmm. But that's, from my knowledge, that's what I believe it comes down to.
Mm-hmm. And what was the other one? Pica and...
There's rumination disorder, which is regurgitation of food without any feelings of nausea, and it's not explained with another medical condition. So I was looking into this, and it could I personally have never met anybody that's had this disorder, but it could happen with infants, with children, and with adults.
Okay.
And so again, it's very important to go and speak to a doctor, a medical provider, and then maybe also seeking therapy and seeing like, okay, why is this happening? What could this be?
So it's regurgitation. What's the difference between this and purging?
This is, there's no nausea, and you're not doing it intentionally. It's just happening.
Okay.
This food is like being regurgitated, and then a little bit of a pre-warning here, but this food is being regurgitated, and either the individual is spitting it out, or they're re-chewing it and trying to digest it.
Okay. So if it happens in children, I've only seen this happen with my babies, where they like will spit up and just kind of swallow it, and I'm like waiting with my hand for it to come out, and it never does.
Yeah.
So if it happens with kids, though, it's not an eating disorder that they're necessarily making the choice, right? Correct. They're just doing it without realizing that that it's not right.
Well, almost the same with pica, right?
Yeah.
So like, I don't think that somebody wakes up and they're like, I'm going to eat chalk today, or I'm going to go outside and eat some mud. It's just there's some sort of maybe nutritional deficiency, maybe the same thing with rumination, maybe there's something going on to where they need to go and speak with a medical provider to figure out, okay, like what's going on here to where we can prevent this from happening.
What are the more common ones?
There's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So this is a lack of interest of eating. Maybe there's a sensory issue with food. You become worried about the consequences of eating. So like, I'm worried about gaining weight. I'm worried about how I can look afterwards. And then the big common ones are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Anorexia has to do with food restriction. And typically people that struggle with anorexia, they are of significantly low weight. So these are individuals that look very thin, they look emaciated, there's an intense fear of gaining weight, and there can be restricting and binging and purging. On the differences between anorexia and then bulimia is you're binge eating, you feel a lack of control with food. When you're binging, you feel like you just can't stop, you can't slow down, and then you participate in behaviors to prevent weight gain. So this could be tons of exercising, using medication, fasting, and then people that can be bulimic can have an appropriate weight appearance. So from an outsider's perspective, they look healthy, they look quote unquote normal, and they could be behind closed doors struggling with this eating disorder.
I think when people hear the word bulimia, they most often associate it with inducing vomiting. Right. But that's not necessarily the case. You said it could also be excessive exercise. Another thing is it can also be linked to using laxatives.
Correct.
It's just anything to basically prevent gaining weight. What is the difference between anorexia and the first one that you mentioned, the one with the really long name?
Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder?
Yes. So it would be because they're both avoiding food, right?
Yep. Yeah. I think that with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, there doesn't have to be that intense fear of gaining weight. So with anorexia, you're avoiding eating because you don't want to gain weight. With avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, you're avoiding food because you're not interested in eating, or there's a sensory issue to the consistency of food. You're worried about the consequences of eating, maybe just like how it makes you feel after you eat, you know, feeling like you're full or getting a stomach ache.
Is that something that you could experience towards the end of life? Because I've had hospice patients, and I think it's typical of those in the elderly age range to have a hard time keeping weight on because they're just not hungry. They don't have an appetite. They'll go days without eating something with any sort of like sustenance because they don't have any like the desire to eat. Could that be this also, or?
I'm not sure. I would have to well, here's the thing. So there's a note with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. It's not due to another medical or psychological diagnosis. So I believe people that are in hospice, it's the preparation of end of life.
Okay. Which
would probably be the medical diagnosis of preparing for death versus something that's not, there's no other known reason of why somebody would be experiencing this. I'm not familiar with this eating disorder. It's not something that I've personally seen or worked with. So that's why somebody that has the specialty in eating disorders would be an appropriate person to talk to. So if you feel like you're struggling with any of these things, that would be a good starting point. Also your medical provider.
What's the first step if you think that one of your loved ones is battling an eating disorder, how do you approach somebody that you think could be going through this without pointing a finger, without making them feel attacked, but you want to bring this to their attention? What's the most gentle way possible to get started on getting them some help?
Yeah, this is so hard because in a way it almost becomes an addiction. There's a lot of shame involved in it. There's a lot of secrecy. And then once they find out, oh, somebody else knows, there can be a lot of, you don't want to admit it. You
like
protect
denial.
Yeah, you protect the eating disorder. It's so hard to try and think about like approaching somebody that might be struggling with this, because if they aren't ready for help, it can be really difficult to try and get somebody help. But I would suggest just trying the best that you can, and even maybe potentially if you're wanting to talk with a loved one, a family member or a friend about it, reaching out to a therapist that does specialize in eating disorders and asking them, okay, where can I start with this person that I'm concerned about, and getting feedback that way.
Eating disorders is the second disorder that leads to the most deaths, with number one being opioid use. Isn't that crazy?
That is. That's wild.
Yeah.
That I did not know.
Yeah. And I would think with it being 2023 and I think we've gotten a lot better than maybe the mid 2000s at like more body acceptance and starting to really like love the shape of our bodies and accept that this is just how God made us and this is how we're built. It's crazy to think that there are still people out there that feel so uncomfortable in their bodies when the world is like, well, maybe not the world, but at least America is like trying to shift toward this new narrative of like, however you are is perfect to us. Like, we're okay, you know? So for it to be number 2 right next to opioid is bananas to me.
Yeah. I think typically eating disorders go hand in hand with another mental health disorder. Depression, anxiety, trauma. It becomes something that you can control. I can control my food and I can control what goes into my body, even if I feel like I can't control anything else. And so it doesn't necessarily even have to do with food at the end of the day. It could just be, this is something that I feel in control of.
And you see a lot of like in the movies where teenagers have parents that are going through a divorce or something like that. Like typically a teenager will do anything to try to keep control, like something. If the rest of their life is spiraling, but something that they can control is what they're eating, what they're putting in their body, and that kind of thing. So you'll see it in a lot of movies and TV shows with teenagers, especially because teenagers don't really have a lot of control over their own lives, and they can't tell you where they want to live or who they want to have contact with, or whatever. All they see is like their world, and everything that they know is crumbling. But they can choose if they're going to eat or not, or if they're going to eat, if they're going to keep it down. So that brings up a good point about it being connected to another disorder, is like that desire to have control, to keep control of something.
Right.
So we had kind of talked about a book that what is it? It's My Life with Ed or Living with Ed.
I believe it's My Life with Ed, and it's a woman who, Life Without Ed by Jenny Schaefer. I believe I said her name correctly. And you can find this book on Amazon, and she writes this book about her own eating disorder, and she names her eating disorder Ed, her eating disorder. And she discusses how she struggled with her eating disorder and then her life moving past her eating disorder. So that would be a good resource to maybe look into, to start maybe some workbooks too of just self-love. Even if, so the person that could be struggling with an eating disorder, maybe you could ask this person, if we're going back to like, what can I do for somebody that I know that I believe is struggling with an eating disorder, asking them like, hey, could we go to therapy together, and just start off that way of whatever else could be going on in their life where they're struggling with this. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be, like, depending on the seriousness of it, could just be like, let's be discussing other areas of your life that you would want to be working on.
Mm-hmm. So maybe if you know somebody already battles depression, maybe use that as like a catalyst to kind of get them to therapy where an eating disorder might be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good idea.
That might be a good idea of a starting point.
Who was it that brought your eating disorder to your attention?
It was myself.
Okay.
Really. I was the one who I got to a point where I was so miserable and so unhappy with myself, and it's been years of being in therapy and working on other areas of my life that I have been able to manage my eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
The intrusive thoughts still happen almost on a daily basis. It's just something that I almost keep at bay with everything that I do for myself, what I believe is healthy for me, and that I'm able to live healthier that way.
And as a teenager, you were an athlete also, right?
Yes.
So what was it like going to practices or games with no nutrition? Like, you had to have been starving at that point. Were you feeling like crap all the time?
Yeah. I mean, I would have the chronic headaches. I didn't have enough energy in practice to push my body. And so, then the coaches would be like, oh, like saying negative things towards me about it, just like, oh, you need to do more, you need to do this and this and this. And then also being in school and seeing my grades falling and not being able to stay awake or pay attention in school was really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I started therapy for myself probably at like 18. I started going consistently to therapy, and then that's when I started to address other things that I thought were more important, past traumas, working on things like that, to where I started to slowly heal from the eating disorder also. But it took many years.
Did you ever bring it up to your parents? Did they ever notice anything and just didn't say anything, or
no?
Did you ever have a conversation with them about it?
No, we never talked about it. And that was my choice. I didn't want them to feel like it was their fault or that they had done anything wrong. So I intentionally didn't bring it up.
Are you comfortable sharing like what your intrusive thoughts are? Like, what is it that your mind tries to tell you about it now as an adult?
Intrusive thoughts could be something like, oh, you should skip today eating. Like, you probably shouldn't eat today for the entire day. or something like, I'll sit down and I'll eat and then I feel guilty because I did eat. Or if I'm really hungry one day and I eat to the point of where my stomach feels full, and then I kind of beat myself up about that because my stomach feels full. Things like that is what I struggle with. And then trying to replace those thoughts and make them into something healthy instead of just constantly negative. So if it's something like, oh, I shouldn't eat today, I'll try and replace it with, well, you know what, today I'm going to make myself go to the gym. And if I want to do my goals at the gym, I have to eat before I go, because I have to give my body nutrition to be able to do what I want to do. And then after the gym, I, tell myself, well, my body has worked very hard. I need to, in return, feed it and love it so that it can continue to do the things that I love for it to do. And then if I feel like, oh man, I shouldn't have eaten that thing that I just ate, I kind of replay what it is that I ate. Like, what was it that I ate that I'm not okay with? Maybe I needed the carbs that I ate. My body was craving it. It needed that extra energy that I'm lacking, or it needed the vitamins, or it needed the nutrition that I just put into my body. And for myself, I need to be okay with that.
Did these thoughts amplify when you were pregnant with your son? Like, worried about weight gain any of that kind of stuff? Was it worse than knowing that your body needed to put the weight on, that your body was going to get bigger naturally?
Unfortunately, that was a big struggle, is just watching. For anybody that has been pregnant or has not been pregnant, when you're pregnant, every time that you go to your doctor appointment, you have to step on the scale, and they're monitoring.
I hate that part. It's the worst. And they do it right out of the gate. It's like you're setting the tone for the rest of the appointment, and you're already making me upset.
It's definitely a mind, it messes with your mind. So watching that scale go up as and you need to do this. You know that your body needs to gain weight for pregnancy, to have a healthy pregnancy. And so ways that I try even now to, I don't have a scale in my house. We have one, but it's in the back of a closet. So that's something that I can't look at every day. And then same thing with like clothing and sizes is really hard. So even being pregnant and watching your clothes get bigger, or like having to get a different size, can be very hard. And so what I personally try and focus on is, what are other goals that I can set for myself that have nothing to do with weight gain and nothing to do with my clothing size. So for myself, I set goals of either in the gym, like what is something that I can set for myself in the gym that's new and exciting for me, or how trying like a new hike. I enjoy being outdoors and hiking, and so like I'll say, okay, well, let's schedule a hike that I can do outside with my family, and enjoying moments and things like that, and then focusing on how I feel in that moment. So focusing on how I feel in the gym. And I also have a personal trainer in the gym, so he helps me with achieving my goals, and I'll communicate, okay, this is what I want to do, and having his feedback saying like, yeah, I think that that's attainable, or maybe we should focus on something else, is like really helpful too, especially in pregnancy, because he can kind of like tune it into, okay, like let's make sure that your pregnancy is going to be okay and that you're physically going to be okay. But having new goals that are exciting outside of just focusing on weight and numbers and sizes is really healthy for me.
What are some other ways that you practice self-love?
Self-love, I think it goes back to also self-care and continuously doing things that I enjoy doing for myself, that I know that if I take the time to do those things for myself, I'll in turn feel better.
I think this is probably a good stopping point, because we do have plans for the next episode to be about self-love. So we will wrap it up on this segment. Tune in next week for the episode about self-love and self-care, some journaling maybe. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.